Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and I just got back from the new film Jack the Giant Slayer. Is the new retelling of Jack and the Beanstalk, or I think the original story was called Jack the Giant Killer. It is the first film from director Bryan Singer since 2008 with Valkyrie, which is about 5 years, I believe. And I think it's actually probably his worst directed film. Jack the Giant Slayer has really nothing to offer. I don't think the plot was very good. There's zero to little character development. And so all the characters, especially the main characters, come off like cardboard cutouts of character types we've seen in a million other movies before. We kind of get to know Jack and the princess, this princess who goes up into the beanstalk and who he has to save. And it takes a lot of liberties with the story, which I don't really like. And it doesn't really have the same majesty or strangeness or magic that you'd really expect from the Jack and the Beanstalk story. Jack the Giant Slayer is very stilted. It reminds me of Bryan Singer's X-Men film, the first X-Men, where it's like kind of stilted and the cutting's not quick enough. And a lot of times what he'll do is, most films cut on action. It's an editing trick so that if you cut on someone moving to another cut of someone also moving, it's more exciting and it's more dynamic. And this film doesn't do that. It would be times where like Jack would fall and everyone's standing still watching him fall, and then you cut to him laying there on the beanstalk. Could have been an exciting sequence if you had shot it better, but when you're shooting it so stilted in that way, and it's even more stilted than the first X-Men film, this film is more like that TV show Once Upon a Time, or that Gulliver's Travels TV movie that NBC made in the 90s with Ted Danson. This film, it looks like it was shot very quickly and on a certain controlled budget, in a way that the first X-Men did. The first X-Men film was very rushed. It was what hurt it, but now I see it's probably, a lot of his fault is in there too, especially from the direction of this. I never thought he'd kind of go back to his direction in the original X-Men film. I thought he had moved past that, but I guess, his 5-year break didn't really serve him that well. Since the film is shot in such a TV way, I found it really boring and dull. I mean, there's so many sequences that if the camera had just sped up and really followed someone and they, had a little more cutting, it would have been exciting, but there's nothing very exciting about this movie at all. And it doesn't help that a plot is filled with kind of writer conveniences, from the time that the princess decides to go on a trip from the castle and then she just suddenly happens upon Jack's house, and there's another part where the giants just suddenly find the beans so they can conveniently have this third act, and the third act comes really out of nowhere. I honestly thought the movie was over. I was like, oh great, this wasn't too long, I can go home now. I didn't really like this movie. And then it just throws you in another act, which, I mean, I guess you have to have a big battle, but it's kind of not keeping with the Jack and the Beanstalk story, because Jack like comes and he steals all this crap and then he leaves and he cuts down the beanstalk and then the one giant dies. And in this film there's like an army of giants. This and the Snow White and the Huntsman film, it's like trying to combine a fairy tale with Lord of the Rings. It's like someone who doesn't really know anything about fantasy and they go, well, Lord of the Rings was a fantasy book, what other fantasy things are there? It's like, well, I don't know anything about fantasy. Maybe Jack and the Beanstalk, that's a fantasy thing. And that much thought is put into it, so that's what you get, is just a cheap knockoff. The visual effects in this film look like they were something from 13 years ago. The giants don't look particularly great. As soon as the film started and they're doing the sequence where they're having the parents of the princess and the farm boy Jack, and they're reading them the Jack and the Beanstalk story, while they're reading it to them, they show like this quick animated thing. I knew right then I was in trouble, because not only did the animation look cheap and kind of inadequate compared to the effects we have now, the shots weren't composed very well. When I think of other films that have done that, like that sequence in The Deathly Hallows Part 1 with the three brothers, that's an amazing sequence, and that's really like gets you into that story. And almost everyone, if you've seen The Deathly Hallows Part 1, you know what I'm talking about. This sequence was so unmemorable, it was almost memorable. It looked like a CG kids TV show. One of the things that's kind of odd about these effects being so bad is one of the reasons they delayed this film for so long is to work on the effects, and I find that pretty laughable and hard to believe. It looks like it had half the budget it needed and half the production time. It's not very conducive to what a big budget fantasy film is now, and I can understand why they pushed it back, because this would look even more ridiculous against the Snow White and the Huntsman film. Even though that film is not very good, like, I think just technically, and the craftsmanship in this film is so much worse than the craftsmanship that's gone on in the other films, especially the effects in Snow White and the Huntsman I quite like, and the effects in this are just so badly done. This is really an embarrassing, inadequate effects movie. It's just kind of hard to believe that this thing came out in 2013. I never thought Ewan McGregor would want to channel his performance from the Star Wars prequels, but for some reason in this film he does. Nicholas Hoult and all the other actors are fairly awkward. Stanley Tucci's always pretty good. This film just frankly didn't work, and it didn't work from the onset because it's not particularly clever. I mean, the only thing I thought that was very clever about it is they kind of get into how stories change and who's telling them and the time they're told in change the story, and they get into that a little bit, but that's about the only real creative idea going throughout it. It looks like a director for hire thing, much like how the first X-Men did with Singer. That film had a lot more going for it than this film does. It at least had some character development and things like that. This film solely feels like a work for hire. It doesn't feel like he got into the characters whatsoever or got into the story. He's just kind of doing it to have a big hit. And you know, some people can get that to work for them, but in this case I don't think really Singer could. And it turns out to be one of his worst directed films, and it shows like his worst tendencies. You look at someone like Bryan Singer, and I think like 10 years ago people were saying how he's going to be like Spielberg and Cameron, all these big effects directors, and you know, 10 years later he's doing crap like this. He really can't have fun with something that he's not into, and you can tell he's not into this. I'm a little disappointed because I really am excited for that X-Men Days of Future Past movie, and if this is the movie he made before it, I am a little worried, even though I think he can direct a good X-Men film, especially with X-Men 2. And if you look at X-Men 2, it's when he got really into a subject matter, and he made an awesome X-Men movie, and probably one of the best superhero films. And then of course if he gets too into something, I guess you get Superman Returns. Jack the Giant Slayer's got to be one of the most awkwardly shot, stilted action movies I've seen in recent memory. It's not very memorable, and it's not very good. It's not an all-out disaster. Well, I guess no, it is kind of an all-out disaster. So if you have seen Jack the Giant Slayer and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.